Hey everyone, are you ready for a deep dive into a topic that's both fascinating and, let's just say, a little sensitive?
Oh, definitely. Always up for a good theological puzzle.
Well, today's puzzle is stigmata, but we're looking at it through a very specific lens, Orthodox Christianity. And we've got this piece by an Orthodox blogger who really doesn't hold back.
I imagine those can get pretty intense.
You have no idea. He's basically wrestling with how something that some people see as like a divine sign, a gift from God, could actually be, well, from his perspective, something a lot darker.
I see. So we're dealing with a real clash of interpretations here.
Exactly. And to really get where he's coming from, we need to kind of step back and understand the historical context, especially the whole Great Schism thing. That's not just a history book footnote for the Orthodox Church.
It's like the foundation of everything. It's why you have Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism as two distinct branches.
Right. And our author sees stigmata as one of those things that just doesn't line up with the Christianity that existed before that split. Like it didn't even exist back then, at least not the way we understand it now.
That's a bold claim. I'm curious to see how he backs that up.
Well, he digs into the Orthodox concept of prelest, which is often translated as spiritual delusion, but it's more than just being tricked or something.
More like being led astray with the best of intentions,
Yeah.
right? Like you think you're on the right path, but it's subtly leading you away from where you need to be.
Exactly. And the scariest part is you might not even realize it's happening. Which brings us to his example of St. Ansbert, who lived well before the schism.
I'm assuming that St. Ansbert has some connection to stigmata.
He did, but it was different. He reportedly had these markings on his body that looks like a cross, but there was no bleeding. And that's a huge distinction, at least from the Orthodox perspective.
It's all about how they view suffering, isn't it? Like it's a part of life, but God doesn't go around inflicting it on people as a reward for being faithful.
Exactly. He uses Job as an example. All that suffering Job went through, it wasn't God saying, hey, you're doing great, have some more pain. It's about how we endure, how we find God in the midst of those trials.
So when you have these cases of stigmata where people are experiencing these incredibly painful wounds, bleeding for years, it kind of clashes with that, doesn't it?
And it's interesting because he almost sees it as trying to physically replicate Christ's suffering, which, from an Orthodox point of view, kind of misses the point.
Almost like they're trying to one-up Christ's sacrifice.
Yeah. It's more about the internal transformation, right?
Yeah.
Becoming more Christ-like through your actions, not by mirroring his wounds. Which brings us to, in the author's eyes, kind of the beginning of this whole stigmata thing. Francis of Assisi.
St. Francis.
Mhm.
Even outside of Orthodoxy, he's a complicated figure.
To put it mildly, and for a lot of Orthodox Christians, he represents a turning point, and not in a good way.
Yeah.
Because he's basically seen as the first person to display stigmata in the way we think of it today. The wounds, the bleeding, the whole 9 yards.
And our author isn't a fan.
He quotes Father Seraphim Rose, who called Francis's spirituality a deceived, presumptuous thing full of pride and a stark break from tradition. Ouch. But that's how strongly some Orthodox Christians feel about this.
So we've got this historical backdrop, this deep unease at the idea of stigmata, and then Francis of Assisi comes along and kind of throws gasoline on the fire. I'm seeing why this is such a touchy subject.
It is, and it gets even more interesting when we start looking at the specific arguments our author makes against stigmata. He does not hold back. So we've got Francis of Assisi really embodying this shift that our author is so concerned about. But what are his actual arguments against stigmata? Like, what's his reasoning here?
He makes a few key points, and he backs them up with scripture, which is really important in Orthodox thought.
That makes sense. So hit us with argument number 1.
He goes straight to the Orthodox understanding of suffering. He even brings up the book of Job, specifically chapter 2, verse 7, where, and I'm paraphrasing here, it talks about Satan going out and afflicting Job with all these painful sores.
Right, the whole Job's getting tested by God thing.
Exactly. But the point he's making is that God doesn't cause the suffering. It's not like a reward for being faithful or anything.
That's an interesting distinction. So it's not that God wants us to suffer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Suffering just is, especially in a world that's kind of messed up, you know. It's how we respond to it, how we go closer to God through those challenges that matters. And that actually leads into his next point, which is all about theosis.
Right, theosis, that whole becoming more like Christ idea.
Exactly. And theosis is a huge deal in Orthodoxy. It's not about reaching some endpoint. It's an ongoing process of spiritual transformation through God's grace.
Okay, got it. So how does stigmata clash with that?
Well, the author sees it as focusing too much on the physical, on literally mirroring Christ's wounds in the flesh. It becomes about, like, achieving this visual similarity to Christ's suffering instead of embracing that deeper internal change that theosis is all about.
So instead of focusing on, like, actually living out Christ's teachings and trying to grow spiritually, it becomes about replicating the visual aspect of his suffering.
Exactly. And it plays into that whole discomfort with Francis of Assisi being hailed as this new Christ figure. For a lot of Orthodox Christians, Christ's sacrifice was a one-time thing. To suggest that we could just, like, copy it, even physically, feels almost disrespectful. Like, it diminishes how important it really was.
It's almost like trying to find a shortcut to spiritual enlightenment or something.
And that actually leads into his final and probably most challenging argument, that stigmata could actually undermine Christ's sacrifice on the cross.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty bold statement. How does he get there?
Think about it. For Christians, Christ's death, the crucifixion, that's everything. It's the ultimate act of love and sacrifice, right? Taking on all of humanity's sins so that we can be reconciled with God. That's kind of the whole point.
Right, I'm following, but I don't see where stigmata fits into that.
Well, he's saying that if you believe God is out there giving people stigmata, inflicting these wounds as some kind of, like, badge of holiness, that it kind of implies that Christ's sacrifice wasn't enough, right?
Like, if people are still being physically marked by suffering in this way, then what was the point of the crucifixion?
Exactly. It challenges this fundamental idea of salvation through Christ's sacrifice,
Yeah.
which is, kind of a big deal in Christianity, especially in Orthodoxy.
So we've got this whole theological framework, this deep-seated discomfort with the whole concept of stigmata from our author's perspective. But then he brings up some real-world examples, and things get even more interesting.
Ah, yes. The images he includes.
Uh,
And his reactions to them are really telling. You can see how these theological beliefs are playing out and how he responds to these very visceral, very visual representations of stigmata.
The first one is a picture of Therese Newman, who, and I might be getting this wrong, supposedly experienced Christ's wounds and even died for a little bit every Friday. Like, what? Oh.
It's pretty out there. And the author's reaction, let's just say he doesn't mince words. He basically said she looks like hell. Now, you can agree or disagree with his language, but it goes back to that Orthodox aversion to equating suffering with holiness.
It's like, for him, it's almost a misinterpretation of what Christ went through,
Yeah.
trying to achieve something through suffering rather than finding spiritual growth in other ways.
Right. And then there's that meme he includes, the one comparing Padre Pio, the famous stigmatist, with St. Simeon, the Fool for Christ. Kind of a weird pairing, don't you think?
A meme in a serious theological discussion. Now, that's an interesting choice, but it does highlight a key difference between how Orthodox and Catholic churches view sainthood, which is a big part of his problem with Padre Pio.
That's a really important point, and I think we need to unpack it a bit more to understand where he's coming from. But first, let's take a quick break.
Okay, so we're back. And before the break, we were talking about those images our author brought up, the ones that really seemed to get under his skin. Like Therese Neumann, who basically claimed to go through a mini crucifixion every week. That's a lot to process, even just hearing about it.
It really is, and our author's reaction is, well, pretty intense. He even says she looks like hell.
Yeah, I saw that.
And, he might not win any awards for sensitivity there, but it shows you how deep this goes for him. That whole Orthodox idea that suffering isn't something God inflicts on people.
It's like he sees her deliberately embracing that level of pain and thinks, how could that possibly be a good thing? How could that be holy?
Exactly. And it feeds into that whole thing we were talking about before, that maybe this is about trying to achieve something through suffering instead of focusing on spiritual growth in a more, traditional way.
And then there's that meme with Padre Pio and Saint Simeon. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one.
It is an odd pairing, but it goes back to that issue of authority, specifically how the Orthodox Church views sainthood, which is different from Catholicism.
Right, because for our author, Saint Simeon being officially recognized as a saint by the Church, that's huge.
It's everything. It means that his actions, even the ones that might have seemed a little out there at the time, are seen as part of his path to holiness. The Church has basically given it the stamp of approval.
So comparing Padre Pio to Saint Simeon, for our author, it's a non-starter because Padre Pio doesn't have that same official recognition from the Orthodox Church.
Exactly. And that actually ties into a broader point he makes about what he sees as these innovations within Catholicism, things that popped up after the schism that he's not so sure about.
Things like stigmata, you mean?
That, and other things like the Rosary, the Stations of the Cross. He sees them as lacking that connection to the early church, that grounding in ancient tradition. He even goes so far as to say that Catholicism after the schism became something utterly alien from the original church.
Wow. Utterly alien is a pretty strong way to put it.
He's not mincing words, that's for sure. But it shows how deeply he believes that these newer practices represent a departure from true Christianity.
He's not against all miracles, though, is he? It's more like he distinguishes between different types.
Right. He talks about these miracles associated with orthodoxy, like icons weeping myrrh, or those stories of bees refusing to sting beekeepers who tend to icons.
And those are okay because they're not introducing some new doctrine or practice. They're more about affirming existing beliefs.
Precisely. They're seen as signs from God that, hey, you're on the right track with this whole icon veneration thing or whatever it might be. They're confirming, not creating.
Which brings us back to that really thought-provoking question our author leaves us with. If miracles are supposed to strengthen faith, what happens when they challenge the very core of what we believe?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It forces us to really examine those things that we might take for granted, those assumptions about our faith, about God, about everything.
It's a good reminder that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about grappling with the mysteries, wrestling with those tough questions, and allowing ourselves to be changed by what we discover. And sometimes those discoveries, those miracles, those moments of divine intervention, whatever you want to call them, they can shake us up a bit. They can make us rethink everything.
It's about being open to that journey, to wherever it might lead.
Exactly. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that question. What happens when the things that are supposed to strengthen our faith end up challenging it in ways we never expected? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.